Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here. It gives me great pleasure to be back, actually, after just a couple of years. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay, so I'll begin without further ado. I want to start with a caveat, which is that some subordinate historians have expressed a concern for, I quote Kian Pandey here, challenging the state's construction of history. And the aim was for them to recover marginal voices and memories, forgotten dreams and signs of resistance. And this was for purposes of writing a history that would not be beholden to victorious concepts and powers like the nation-state and bureaucratic rationalism. So whilst this kind of enterprise is definitely valuable, I contend that we must actually reckon with the effects of modern state apparatuses on the production of history, and that too on an unprecedented scale. Now, in South Asia, as elsewhere, history may operate as a powerful vehicle for producing and transmitting senses of belonging to the nation. As the colonial education system provided avenues for a job and a middle-class status for an ever-increasing number of aspirants, it transformed the significance of and expanded the access to history. In the process, it provided the means for expressing a variety of collective identities. And with the advent of a generalized system of mass education in post-colonial India, and even more so since the creation of regional states in the 1950s and 60s, history and institutionalized knowledge generally acquired greater prominence in actors' and citizens' imaginaries. Arguably, in these regional states, schooling has further strengthened the sense of history and effects of belonging among members of the public. So I'll specifically focus on what is going on in the Maharashtra state. And this state offers a fascinating illustration of attempts at producing an exclusivist model of a homogeneous Indian citizens. Whether run by a long-standing secular dynasty or by an extreme right-wing populist coalition, the state has, since its inception in 1960, sought to build Maharashtrian citizenship upon notions of Hindu-ness, Maratha-ness, Marathi language, and a historical heritage anchored in the figure of hero-warrior Shivaji Maharaj. So this is a map of India, and the red part, the red spot, is the state of Maharashtra. Now, Shivaji. Now, the relation of the region to the nation in this part of India is an intricate one, and the notion of Maharashtrian citizenship predetermines and encompasses that of Indian citizenship. And it's a citizenship whence Muslims are implicitly and explicitly excluded, and I'll elaborate on this as I'm going into the talk. Now, the historical figure of Shivaji Maharaj, and you can see a picture of him on the book cover, a hero-warrior incarnation of the Maratha/Indian nation, offers a privileged entry point into the production of locality and nation. And you'll see here that when I really sort of explore how a sense of belonging to the nation is produced and transmitted through the textbooks in particular, this sense of the nation really has to be articulated with a sense of the region as Maharashtra. Now, this historical figure of Shivaji also presents an interesting parallel with models of national heroes in Europe. In their work on the comparative making of national heroes, Pierre Saint-Livre, Daniel Fabre, and François Zonabin noted that the figure of the ploughman soldier has often been an archetypal model that best represents legitimate attachment to a nourishing soil and Mother Earth. The character of Shivaji appositely fits that model, as he is often portrayed, even in competing versions, as the chief of the Marathas, a caste cluster known as warriors and tillers of the land. So you can see the equation here with the land. Chilton's first and long official encounter with the hero occurs in class 4, so they're aged about 9 or 10. And during that year, the history textbook is almost entirely devoted to the narration of his legendary deeds. So I'll now move to a section entitled Textbook, History and Secularism in the Vernacular. Now, the production of primary school textbooks in the state of Maharashtra is entrusted to an independent, though public, organisation, and this is the Maharashtra State Bureau of Textbook Production and Curriculum Research. Thus, the manuals are relatively unaffected by changes in the politics of the regional governments. To a large extent, one can say that they are the outcome of a consensus among Marathi language educationists of all walks of life. Although some dissent may occur, the Marathi manuals thus arrived at may be envisaged as useful illustrations of dominant norms and values extant in Maharashtrian society at large. These norms and values have been shaped in part by the reconfiguration of historical and historiographical traditions over the past century. For instance, the Class 4 textbook, which you can see here, almost entirely devoted to the history of Shivaji, draws on some shared historical accounts from early 20th century historians that have fed into Maharashtrian popular culture, including that of Marathi cinema since the 1960s, when the manual was prepared. This manual, it's important to emphasize, was to become the only available version for the following decades, and to this day, any attempt to amend it has been met with violent opposition by some sections of the population. And now we move to a subsection called Loss in Translation, Writing Communal Tensions. If textbooks provide a window onto the worldview of those who make them and the society where they originate, their analysis can form but one part of the study of syllabi and form and curriculum. And indeed, however much they partake in the production of the school's educated self, they account for only a standardized, almost ossified version. Of crucial bearing is the ebb and flow of daily interaction among teachers and children at school, between children, and with their parents and society at large. This calls for an exploration of the articulation between pedagogical tools on the one hand and daily praxis on the other. What teachers and children do in the classroom and outside it becomes of paramount importance for studying the production of senses of belonging at the local, regional and national levels. So it's not just about what history or other kinds of textbooks have to say, but also how this knowledge is actually being used and relayed or not in the classroom itself and outside of the school. So the remainder of this section documents both the contents of the history manual for Class 4 as well as its usage in the classroom and beyond. And here we must take seriously Sudipto Kaviraj's advocacy to pay heed to the vernacular phrasings of political notions such as secularism, religion, civil society, and so on, used in Indian society. And the need to do so is nowhere more apparent than in the comparison of the two versions, English and Marathi, of the Class 4 history textbook. So you can see just the cover for the Marathi version on the left-hand side and the English one on the right. The textbook was prepared during a period of heightened conflict with Pakistan, with repercussions on communal tensions across India. Yet these were also post-Nehruvian times. We're talking about the late 1960s. And these were times during which the spirit of the great national socialist and secularist leader still dominated. So the preparation of the textbook reflected these politically conflicted and conceptually eclectic times. A conscious, deliberate attempt was made to produce the textbook within a secularist and ecumenical framework, avoiding any explicit discussion of religion, and this to the extent that whenever Muslims were referred to in the textbook, it was in the garb of caste and never faith or religion. Okay. And we'll see examples of this later on. Now, despite these conscious efforts to promote an inclusive framework purportedly conducive to social harmony, many secularist critics in Maharashtra have commented on invitation to violence stemming from the official Class 4 textbook. And in their views, the official manual should lay more emphasis on Shivaji's skills as an administrator rather than tirelessly detail the hero's warfare and acts of aggression, even in the name of self-rule. And just to give you an example of the sense of what they mean, out of 19 lessons, they remarked, 13 deal with war, conquest, battle, spilling of blood, heroism, bravery, and so on, while a meagre 3 are devoted to Shivaji's skills as an efficient administrator, the people's king, and a living source of inspiration, in quoted commas. Now, even if these narratives are written in ecumenical fashion, they cannot but generate communal mistrust and hatred because of their antagonistic and often religious formulation, explicit or implicit. So, despite many corrective attempts throughout the book, emerges a dominant narrative pitting Maratha, as in de facto Hindu, and Muslim communities against one another. And this result is largely due to the systematically differential portrayal of the protagonists as Hindus and Muslims, turning religion into the main determinant for social action on either side. And religion appears one of the main reasons why Shivaji resolves to set up his own Swaraj, encapsulated by the motto Swadesh, Swadharma, and Swadbhasha. Now, turning the entire, by framing the entire account in Hindu terms, the textbook makers unwittingly gave it as a communal slant. Since then, some of the textbook's wording has been reproduced almost verbatim on a Hindutva website. When I say Hindutva, I mean I'm referring to Hindu right-wing militancy. Yeah. So the wording of that textbook has been reproduced almost verbatim on one of those websites, thus fueling latent antagonism between Hindus and Muslims, some more. And in many ways, however, the issue of communalism is also one of shifting interpretation and translation. And let me explain this properly. Now, the history textbook was first written in Marathi and subsequently translated into English and the 5 other languages recognized for instruction for English in the States. Although the Marathi and English versions are at first blush very similar, they contain a number of divergences that bear potentially deleterious significance in the loaded and sensitive context of communalism in India today. And the English version, on the whole, creates a more contained, dispassionate reading in 2 ways, where the Marathi text uses graphic depictions and vivid, direct passages meant to convey the liveliness of the story and also arouse pupils' sustained interest. The English one opts for a distancing effect achieved by more sober phrasing and use of indirect style. So there's a kind of distancing at play there. I'll return to this and I'll provide you with some examples in my discussion of Muslim schooling. Now, in addition, it also reformulates some passages, the English version, in a more secular conscious garb. For instance, where the Marathi version maintains an othering, implying Hindu and Muslim communal distinction, the English translation adapts the Marathi version to the ideal of a secular nation, commonly propounded in the English language, print, and other media. The English version privileges an egalitarian treatment of Shivaji's subjects, even in overt cases of disloyalties, and I've got an example here, which goes like this. So, disloyal people, such disloyal people, persons, were severely punished, irrespective of their caste or religion. And by contrast, if you see the Marathi original, it does introduce subtle distinctions of belonging. To the traitors, he administers severe punishment, whether he be from his own stock or from. So then, there's already the premise of the distinction at play. Now, the issue of Muslim loyalty is a crucial thread running through the entire manual's narrative, and I don't have time to really give you a lot more examples here, but I'm happy to go into more detail in the discussion. Muslim officers in Shivaji's armies are referred to in cautious terms whose initial interpretive purpose is diffused, at least in the original version. And here again, the Marathi and English text differ significantly, if only by one word, and I'll give you just one more example. In one of the English translation, after listing those of Shivaji's officers that were Muslims, as they were all servants of Swaraj, the Marathi original, by contrast, states, after listing all of these people, states, but they were all faithful servants of Swaraj, letting in a whole world of understated mistrust in this but. Now, this very wording generated considerable ambiguity in classrooms, especially in discussions of the notion of Swaraj, qualified as Hindavi. Now, the phrase of, I showed you Swaraj and Hindavi, Swaraj. The phrase Hindavi Swaraj itself lies at the centre of the tentative secularist promotion of the consensual Shivaji narrative. And the official version of the concept proffered in the textbook is that of a secular Indian style, meaning a recognition and tolerance of all faiths, rather than a strict separation of faiths in the public domain. So that's secularism, Indian style. So this is the version proffered in the textbook, that of a secular model of religious tolerance and acceptance within the political community. And in lesson 19, which is the last lesson of the textbook of the history of Shivaji, the dream of the Chhatrapati Hindavi Swaraj is explained as follows. Anyone who lived in Hindustan, no matter to what community or religion he belonged, was a Hindavi. So you can see a very ecumenical definition at work here. And this echoes the first lesson where Hindavi Swaraj is said to be based on justice, fair play, and equal treatment to people of all castes and religions. However, the term Hindavi is never specified further, and despite the textbook bureau's professed concern for secularism, such lack of clarity and specification leave the door open for misinterpretation and distortion, even in the classrooms of well-meaning teachers. And I now move to a subsection entitled Classroom Negotiations, Open Narratives, Ambiguous Interpretations. And we're in the school in Kolhapur, which is in the southernmost part of Maharashtra, and it's one of the oldest Marathi primary schools. So we're following Mrs. Dalavi, who's a Marathi woman in her early 30s, and she begins the history period devoted to the last lesson about Shivaji's history. So it recapitulates the entire syllabus of Shivaji's history. And we've just reached the third paragraph about Shivaji's respect for all saints and religious places, temples, mosques, and churches alike. The teacher conscientiously emphasizes this point, reiterating that all kinds of people and jats and castes, including Muslims, lived in Shivaji's Swaraj. And then she puts her book aside and she proceeds to explain in a pseudo-dialogue form, and this is what you've got in front of you. And she begins, the Muslim armies were more numerous, Hindu people were less. Even so, did Shivaji get scared? And this is a way of engaging the students' attention. And the pupils shake their heads. No. And you can see that the body language in Marathi classes, in classrooms, really testifies to a sheer engagement with this kind of history which has been taught to them. So, the children are sort of all engaged, their bodies tense, and they're sort of leaning forward to really engage with what is happening in the classroom. And the teacher continues, no, he didn't. He fought for his own Dharma, his own language, and his own country. So again, this Trinitarian association of Swadharma, Swadhasham, and Swadesh. She goes on, he fought for Hindavi Swaraj. So again, that concept that we encountered before. And then without really sort of marking any pause, she goes, who was the enemy? So some students you shout, Adil Shah, who was one of the enemies that they've become acquainted with in the classwork. And so the teacher then nods and adds, he was a Muslim king. The enemy, who was he? A Muslim king. So this is where you can see how, even with the best of intentions, because this teacher is definitely one of the most secular-minded ones that I've come across, there's something of a slippage here which is taking place. And I've really chosen this vignette because it's one of the less obviously slanted ones. I mean, I could have given you sort of much more dichotomous kind of examples, but I really wanted to choose this one because it really sort of shows the difficulty of even with the best of intentions of really sort of sticking to a secularist framework. Why it's teaching the history of Shivaji, especially in the Marathi language. Now, later on, Mrs. Dalari invited me to test the children's knowledge of Shivaji's history and asked about their favourite episodes. Many pupils referred to the loyalty and heroic deeds of Shivaji's captains and army. And to boys and girls alike, Shivaji's greatest achievement in that class is that of having fought all his life to bring about Swaraj and having destroyed the enemy. Yes. And then I asked the pupils when they mentioned Hindu Swaraj, I asked them what this means, and then they start giving me definitions. Hindu Swaraj means those who live in Hindustan in free Swaraj. And then the teacher reiterates, again with the best of intentions, they can be of any religion, they can be Hindu, Muslim, Christian, anything. And then the same student returns and says, because I asked them then, well, do you speak about your history lessons at home? And the same student comes up and says, yes, at least with Mummy. And so I asked, so what does Mummy say then? Here's the answer. Shivaji fought for our Swaraj. Had he not established our Swaraj, we would all be living in a Muslim Raj. So you can see how all the sort of best meaning attempts at instilling a sort of secularist, tolerant, ecumenical, faithless teaching of this regional/national history is totally failed. Also because, as I said, this teaching does not happen sort of, in a totally watertight space without any relation to what is happening in the rest of society, and certainly at least with their parents, they have, children have the kind of interaction and also engage with what is being taught to them, whether in the space of home or the larger space of Maharashtrian society. So I want to unravel the many strands of argumentation here, because it seems to me that even in one of those apparently anodyne examples, there is a lot of ambivalence and ambiguity in the teachers, parents and children's utterances. And these need attention, if only because they may let the balance tilt either way in case of heightened communal attention. And the notion of Hindu Swaraj, thus formulated, is problematic not only because of the ambiguity inherent in it, but also because of its performative reiteration. And what this means is that by emphasizing throughout how Shivaji made no distinction between Hindus and Muslims, and no difference between the holy books of Hindus and Muslims, clearly a modernist and post-colonial version is being reshaped, one of monolithic Hinduism and Islam, and in which difference, on grounds of being negated as a potential cause for unjust or unfair action, is discursively reinforced as difference. And in the process, the separateness and distinctiveness of both Hindus and Muslims are further strengthened. Consequently, groups and social actors with different agendas, including those with Hindu right-wing leanings, may interpret Shivaji's tolerance differently. In the latter version, Hindu Swaraj is one of tolerance towards Muslims, with the implicit understanding that they are precisely being tolerated in Maharashtra. And this is the version that Chief Sema, which is one of the hardered some of the soil's Hindu right-wing parties and other Hindu right leaders have repeatedly voiced in their fiery declarations and speeches over the past 4 decades. Now, the presence of Muslims in India has increasingly been made conditional, that is, conditioned to a majoritarian political principle. Muslims, as part of the minority, should just conform to the majority's rule, and this includes debates of a uniform civil code premised on reconstructed Hindu cultural notions, which have been debated over the past 10 years. Of course, the same official textbook narrative lends itself to other, more generous interpretations focusing on Shivaji's tolerance to minorities. Yet the Marathi version remains one of systematized communal distinctiveness, wherein the issue of loyalty always seems to loom large. For this very reason, Urdu language schools, although expected to comply with the same history curriculum, and rarely comply with this regulation. And this now brings me to Urdu schooling and the Muslim minority community. And just to give you, the sense of how Marathi children engage with the textbook and the history of Shivaji, I ask them to draw from whatever they wanted. Students of that year, I said, I want to take your drawings home with me, and just to show people what it is I've been up to, and show them what children of your age in Marathi classrooms engage with, do what they're interested in. So I didn't give them specific instructions as to draw Shivaji images, and this was overwhelmingly what the children do in that year. And this was very different from, say, from what happened in Urdu schools. Now, what kind of effects does schooling have on the production of a minority community, often defined against the majority? And how do members of either group experience the sociological reality thus produced? Muslims in Western India represent the other against which a common sense of Maharashtrianness has been constructed, not least through schooling. In addition, the position of political power enjoyed by successive Mughal dynasties and Indo-Muslim sultanates from the 8th through to the 19th centuries stand in stark contrast with the conversely marginal position occupied by the Muslim community today. The latter is, however, a demographically significant majority minority community. This is the largest minority community in India today. The legitimacy of Muslim Indians' participation in the political life of the country has been jeopardized by ongoing attempts made by Hindu right-wing parties to define citizenship along the lines of monolithically reinvented Hinduism, as I've already alluded. And this has caused great concern over minority status becoming that of second-class citizens. So the whole issue of this particular textbook and the issue of history teaching in Maharashtra needs to be seen in this wider context. So the question then becomes, how through an expanded state apparatus may both history and language become powerful means for further anchoring differential senses of belonging and allegiance while reshaping their attendant narratives? Even though Urdu was the language of the elite in northern India until the turn of the 20th century, Urdu language mass education is relatively recent, especially in Western India. In Kolhapur, where I did research, the high school started at the turn of the 20th century under the auspices of the local ruler, was for a long time the only one available in that district, and it was only fairly recently in the late 1990s and early 2000s that more Urdu medium schools were opened. Now, they do cater for Muslim children only, for obvious political reasons, as will become clear. In the early 2000s, which is the latest data I've got, the town was host to 6 Urdu primary schools, catering to about 2,000 pupils, out of a general total of 61,000. Now, how schooling in differential media of instruction may produce heightened polarisation of identifications is a crucial issue. True, what gets taught at school is not de facto taken in by passive recipients, and schooling alone does not determine and create sense of belonging and allegiance. Children, teachers, parents, and other educational officials play an influential part in life at school as they negotiate and shape state injunctions, relating them to ongoing political events, both within and outside the country. And all these negotiated productions may crucially contribute to the social and political constructions of persons and citizens, especially when they feed upon structures of feeling existing within society. Yet the reproduction of these structures of feeling is also relayed and drawn upon by state institutions, not least of schooling. How the latter informs or reshapes these structures of feeling is therefore of prime import, especially in the context of recent access to public instruction, as is the case in Maharashtra. And what I mean by this is that generalised access to public instruction in Maharashtra really dates back to the last 25 to 30 years. And so with this has come greater visibility given to official education. And school really has become a site of identity crystallisation to an unprecedented extent. So the issue of language and identity in Maharashtra and more largely in India today has to be seen in this particular context. And the fact that primary instruction is permitted in the regional state in 7 languages has also enabled distinct linguistic groups to maintain and reproduce themselves to an extent that was not possible before. So it has also reinforced a sense of unity that did not necessarily, within these communities, that did not necessarily exist in such explicit terms in the past. So whereas language was primarily an indicator of difference that could often be superseded by other characteristics shared with the rest of the regional population, it has now become a marker of sheer otherness, both in the space of school and within regional society at large. And to this extent, it now represents a crucial mediation of your claims of belonging to a particular group, other than the dominant one, as demonstrated in the case of Urdu-educated Muslims in Western Maharashtra today. And for example, most families sending their children to Urdu school did not themselves speak much Urdu, as noted by some teachers, and their use of Urdu is actually a fairly recent one. They commonly used Hindi, or rather what was derogatorily called Musalman in that part of India. So most parents and teachers were actually first-generation literates and really placed an emphasis on Urdu becoming the marker of their identity. And that really sort of became the case, especially from the late 1980s to the 1990s onwards. So Urdu became the Muslim language, which it never was before. Now, what's important in this construction is that then the role of Marathi language and Maratha history then becomes totally elided in the context of Urdu media instruction at the profit of a direct link to the nation, so bypassing the nation, the Maharashtrian region/nation. And this is why there's so much issue around the teaching of the history of Shivaji for Urdu region schools. So I'm now moving to a subsection entitled Shunning Regional Narratives, where I'll elaborate on this. Now, one of the greatest differences between Urdu and Marathi language education lies in the contrast between the respective modalities of teaching the history of Shivaji Maharaj. Now, as I've explained, Shivaji epitomizes 2 overlapping conceptions of the nation, one which is regional, Maratha, which is the prototype for the other national one, In other words, for a Marathi-speaking student, in the larger teaching of Marathi history, Marathi/Maratha history, Shivaji created the prototype for the Indian nation, and not just the Maharashtrian nation. Okay. His model was really what used, what enabled the production of an Indian nation at a later stage. Further evidence of this is actually given in the textbook, in that Class 4 Shivaji, Class 4 standard textbook, where the last remaining lessons of the textbook are actually devoted to the Indian nation, its constitution, its national symbols, a little bit of civics instruction. So as a kind of logical continuation of the Maharashtrian nation. So what of Urdu medium instruction and teaching of that kind of history then? When asked about this history in Marathi schools, most children would respond with much enthusiasm and often shouted for attention to speak first. In Urdu schools, by contrast, and although the curriculum was identical in all subjects save language, Shivaji was not celebrated at all, and certainly not as the praised hero and glorified founder of the Marathi nation, nor even of the Indian nation. And this was dramatically illustrated by the incidents ensuing at the time of my first visit to the Urdu Corporation School, where I accompanied several officials. I'll tell you about the story. Now, when I accompanied these officials, it was for the purpose of getting to know more primary schools, and these were officials from the municipality, and the municipal corporation, as it's called, is in charge of anything to do with primary instruction in the district. So I went along with these officials to that Urdu school, and of all the classrooms, the officials purposely chose to stop in class 4. Now, in contrast with classrooms in Marathi schools, the whitewashed walls in that classroom were bare for the most part, with no posters of Shivaji or related heroes and heroines adorning the wall. There was really nothing in the way of this kind of history. And I was all at once invited to question the children on the syllabus and their knowledge of Marathi. To me, this was a very unexpected and extremely uncomfortable position, because I hadn't at all expected to be sort of roped in any kind of agenda that I didn't even realise that the officials had at the time. And the only way I could find to mitigate the command was to combine Hindi, the official national language, and knowing that Hindi and Urdu are actually very, very Germanic languages. So my hope was to sort of befriend those children in the classroom rather than to impose the Marathi language on them. Maybe you want to know that despite its history of nationalised Sanskritization in the 19th century, Hindi really, quite apart from this clear association with Hindu speakers in the northern Hindi belt, Hindi in Maharashtra is really a language that, just for being official, it carries over to national integration, to the extent that Muslims studying the Marathi language are better integrated within those who are better integrated with the regional society would often claim to speak Hindi rather than Muslim or Urdu. So Hindi was a kind of mediating language. And so I reluctantly started in Hindi. Do you speak Marathi? So, yes, almost sort of inaudible voices. Then, what subjects do you study? I mean, I really sort of tried to ask as non-committal questions as possible. And then the answers came: Urdu, maths, science, geography, and then reluctantly history. And then at that point, what history interjected one of the corporation officials. And before I could move to another question, the senior official in charge really lost her temper on glaring at the pupils and barked at them in Marathi, "Aren't you studying Shivaji's history?" So reluctantly the pupils started nodding. So she went on, "Well, say so then." And then she prompted the schoolmaster to ask them questions. And again, in contrast to the kinds of questions asked by teachers in Marathi schools, these questions were of the most basic kind here. Questions such as, what is Shivaji's name? What is Shivaji's father's name? What is that of his mother? So very sort of basic, really sort of absolutely non-political questions. And this was a situation really far removed from those in Marathi schools where one really witnessed sheer exaltation and enthusiasm at the mere mention of the hero's name. And at this point I have to say that my reason had turned to utter discomfort, and I declined to pursue the question answer expanded further, much to the education official's disappointment. And then we left the classroom and made for the office. And as we sat there waiting for tea, one of the corporation officials remarked in an aside to the senior official, "These people are not teaching Shivaji's history because it's a problem to them." Later on, back in the car, I asked the officials what the issue was about teaching Shivaji's history. And the one who made the earlier comment referred to the doubt, and this was the English word used, the doubt Muslim people have about teaching it. And the senior official, the one who really sort of lost it, in turn explained the reason they're not teaching it was that Shivaji had defeated the Roman rule over 3 centuries earlier, and then she, in the same breath, made comments about how these people needed to be kept in check, especially by right-wing parties. Now, I move on to a subsection called Dominant Regional Narratives and Experiences of Muslimness. It seems to me that this incident captures both non-Muslim officials' perceptions of what is called Muslims and willingness to embrace regional history of their own, and the real reluctance among many Maharashtrian Muslims of different generations toward the teaching of this official history. The order teachers in the course of research later, because I actually went back to their school, and it took me quite a while to really disassociate myself from those officials that had been so ruthless that I had been forced to accompany on that first visit. So the rest, all of the other visits I made to them for the ensuing months, I really sort of made sure to speak Hindi with them and not Marathi, and to just sort of sit with them and just listen to what they had to say, and really making clear that I was no agent of these corporation officials. And then gradually, they shared with me this reluctance that they had about teaching this regional history. And this reluctance also has to do with the ways in which Shivaji's foes were regularly portrayed in Marathi schools. And some of these people also, because of the lack of order in medium facilities, had to study at one point. The teachers had to study in Marathi medium early on. And so they were actually used to the kinds of portrayals, negative portrayals of Shivaji's foes, always portrayed as ridiculed as stupid Muslims, and also the very sort of graphic portrayal of their being defeated by Shivaji. On this picture you can see Shivaji meets Afzal Khan. Shivaji stands on the right-hand side and Afzal Khan is to the left. And the narration refers to how Shivaji, although he was a lot smaller and more feeble than Afzal Khan, actually was more agile and cunning, that's how he defeated him. When I refer to the kinds of differential modalities of narrativity in the textbooks, in the English and Marathi version, here's an example here, that in the Marathi original we have very sort of graphic, vivid description of Shivaji's, Shivaji in action, defeating his Muslim enemy, with, swoosh, automatic resources, and compared with this, the English textbook sort of, is a little bit more distant and looks at the events from a slightly more sort of neutral kind of perspective. And again, there's a lot of vivid graphic depictions of Shivaji defeating his Muslim enemies. In most constructs, this is how this is depicted and also recollected at the end of the year when recapitulating the whole curriculum. So this is part of. This is also part of what Marathi school children very often are encouraged to really relish it and to respond to when they're asked, what did Shivaji do? What are his really sort of noteworthy deeds? And the emphasis really very often in classrooms is not on Shivaji's skills as a great administrator, but rather on his very graphic slaughtering of his Muslim opponents, rather than Mughal or other. So this also partly explains, the reluctance, the very profound reluctance encountered among order teachers to teach this regional history. Now, at issue here is also that Muslim children in non-Urdu schools are studying in Urdu. So that Muslim children in non-Urdu schools are studying in Hindu-dominant schools, and more generally within an increasingly Hinduized curriculum. And this, despite the autonomy of the textbook bureau that I mentioned earlier. And indeed, compared with the previous Marathi textbook series of the early 1980s, in other subjects, there has been a glaring shift from a positive appraisal of Muslim legal historical contribution to a total revision thereof. For instance, the Class 4 Marathi textbook, so the language textbook, of 1982, incorporated a lesson in Mubarak, described as an occasion for celebrating friendship and amity. Its successor no longer makes any mention of any Muslim festival whatsoever. And this stands in stark contrast with the new and overabundant references to Hindu festivals. So despite a relative autonomy of the textbook bureau, there has been an increasing shift towards a marked Hinduization in very subtle ways, which are not always apparent to you in the naked eye. But what the effect of this has been is that the implicit notion of a historical Hindu continuity, where Islamic presence is but a minor accident, is reinforced in the process. And it's as if all the good work of preaching unity and living together had been gradually relegated to the background when not just altered. Obviously, varying according to institution, teacher, and caste is how the teaching of this Hinduized curriculum is made explicit and negotiated, especially in the presence of Muslim students. These account for 6% to 10% of the student population in the majority of privately run schools, including outwardly Hindu right-wing sympathetic schools. And in Maharashtra and Kolhapur in particular, over and explicit manifestations of attitudes or expressions of thoughts and feelings against Muslims were rare. I mean, on the public stage, apart from these political Hindu right-wing settings. In the privacy of homes, however, ordinary social actors were more likely to share their reserve on the issue of Muslims, and on these occasions there surfaced a deep sense of otherness in relation to Muslim customs and practices, and Muslims emerge as the unspoken other, always ever present in the shadow of public stages and at the back of non-Muslim Russians' minds, archetypically antagonistic, but rarely acknowledged as such in ordinary dealings. Say on the platforms of Hindu right-wing politicians, as I said, and I can give you examples of this. So even the phrase non-Muslim Maharashtrian sounds somewhat like impunity, as if on either side of the divide, Muslims could never truly be Maharashtrians, and conversely, true Maharashtrians could never be Muslims. And I'll end here and start with the discussion.
The Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism is an interdisciplinary student-led research association founded by research students and academics in 1990 at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We seek to fulfil two broad objectives: to facilitate and maintain an interdisciplinary global network of researchers, academics, and other scholars interested in ethnicity and nationalism, and to stimulate, produce, and diffuse world-class research on ethnicity and nationalism. We do this through our global membership, our two leading journals, Nations and Nationalism and Studies in Ethnicity and Nationalism, our newsletter, The Ruritanian, which provides key updates on information in the field, and through our programme of events. Our YouTube channel features videos from our annual conferences, seminar series, lectures and debates. You can find us online at lse.ac.uk/ASEN, on Twitter at ASEN Events, or on Facebook at facebook.com/ASEN Events.